So, without objection, we will then start. Why don't you start us off on the first of the three topics, which I guess is the affordable housing bonus section.
Sure.
If you could, leave some time for the council to be able to ask questions. I'm anticipating you guys are only going to use about half the time or so, up to 30 minutes. That'll give 25 minutes for the council to ask questions.
Sure. Mayor and Council Rodney Gonzalez, Assistant City Manager for Economic Opportunity and Affordability. With me today are the members of the LDC team as well as various consultants assisting us with the project. And for the viewing public, as a reminder, this is after first reading in December. City Council, or as part of first reading, Council adopted various amendments and provided additional direction to staff for the first reading draft. And since that time, staff has been hard at work making various revisions in accordance with Council amendments and direction. And I applaud staff and our consultants for the hard work that they've done since that time. Last Friday, staff released the second reading draft version, as well as a staff supplemental report number 3 and revised maps. And today and tomorrow are work sessions to provide context to the information that was released on Friday. For the public who is watching or who may view this briefing later, today is one step of an iterative process. The code and the associated map have changed since first release in October, and undoubtedly there will be additional changes on the way. We are in the second reading stage, and the total process involves 3 readings. And as critical and important as the code is, it is one of many tools that our community will use to address various issues and challenges that we face. With that, I am going to hand it over to Nick Baudet.
Thanks, Rodney. If we could pull up the presentation, let's see. I wanted to go through a status update, mainly the timeline, and then I'm going to hand it over to Brent to go over some highlights of the supplemental staff report number 3, and then we'll dive into an overview of the mapping that has come out with the second reading revision, an overview of the density bonus program calibration, as well as the new housing capacity information. So with regards to timeline,
and with respect to those last 3 things, we're going to hit one of those topics. You called mapping first, and then you said the bonus, and then you said
and then housing capacity.
We'll do it in that order.
Correct.
Okay? So when you're done the presentation on mapping, give
we'll
it back
questions.
To us.
That's right. Thank you. So moving forward through February, we're here today at work session. Tomorrow we have work session starting at 9 a.m. where we'll go over renderings of the zones as well as non-zoning regulations. And then we will start second reading, the first day of second reading on February 11th through the 13th. So with regards to the staff report that was released, as Rodney mentioned, on Friday, the 31st, there were 199 amendments that are listed in the report that have responses to them. And we'd like to highlight about 10 minutes worth of those for the public and for you. And Brent's going to go ahead and highlight those.
Brent Lloyd, LDC team, and I'll try to be brief. I think we've got a lot of meaty items we want to get into, so I'm just going to give a brief overview. So the staff report that was posted on Friday explains in detail how we've tried to address all 199 amendments, and we've addressed they're all council's amendments at this point, but we've divided it in terms of whether they come from Planning Commission, our supplemental reports, or individual council members. And besides explaining the amendments, we've tried to also provide our thought process and the analysis that went into how we address the issues. And in particular, I think Anik mentioned there were approximately 10% of the amendments that we found difficult to address as you all framed them. And so we've tried to explain the challenges that we confronted in part so that as we move into second reading, we can work with you all to find alternatives for furthering your objectives. And we're, on that note, available to work individually with council offices as well to help make the second reading process as efficient as possible and help you all to frame amendments that will further your objectives. With that in mind, I just want to highlight just an overview of some of the amendments that we think are of most interest to council and to the community. In particular with respect to mapping, which you'll hear more about today, we have proposed, per your direction and per the guidance from Planning Commission and our own supplemental reports, to reduce or eliminate the application of missing middle zones for areas where redevelopment is most likely to exacerbate displacement pressures. And in particular, that means applying comparable equivalent R2 zoning in areas that are identified as susceptible or early type 1 per the UT Uprooted report that has guided a lot of our mapping decisions. We've additionally proposed to reduce the depth of transition areas on predominantly residential corridors, and in general, that has involved counting the corridor fronting lot as part of the distance measurement. And we've also considered additional context-sensitive criteria for particular corridors that have unique features. Also, with respect to mapping, and you'll hear more about this today, we've proposed a reduction of the application of missing middle to address areas that are particularly hit by localized flooding problems. And finally, and this will also account for a lot of our presentation today, we've attempted to make up for the loss of capacity through mapping missing middle areas, zones in other areas, particularly the high opportunity. As far as text revisions, again, we'll be available to talk more at tomorrow's work session about these, but we also want to just highlight some of the ones that we think are of the most importance to council, particularly with respect to the preservation incentive, which is a unique tool that we are developing that will preserve existing structures, at the same time providing limited development incentives to increase number of units. We've proposed significant changes and revisions to the preservation incentive, and in particular, we have proposed limiting it to development that adds at least 1 unit per the goal of increasing units. We've also proposed counting the new units against Florida area ratio, context sensitivity, and ensuring that development better fits within the fabric of existing neighborhoods has been one of the guiding principles of this effort. And we've also proposed more carefully limiting alterations of the existing structures and providing stronger enforcement and administrative authority. And then finally, we've made some significant revisions that we'll talk about tomorrow, I think, with regard to multifamily structures that are taking advantage of the preservation incentive. Along similar lines, we've proposed a general recalibration of Florida area ratio to achieve more context-sensitive development that better furthers the goal of more units, but not necessarily larger single-unit structures. And in particular, we proposed reductions in FAR for the R2A and R2B zones that we hope will help minimize the pressure towards one-for-one replacements. And you will see tomorrow, I think, some modeling that illustrates how we've gone about recalibrating and revising the applicable FAR limits. And in keeping with the theme of graduation and sort of limiting increased entitlements to development that's going to further housing goals, we have proposed a graduated impervious cover thresholds that will limit increases to projects that are providing more units rather than just larger units. And in particular, one of the key features of this approach is that we've proposed to maintain the streamlined regulations for projects that have 50% impervious cover or less, or up to 5,000 square feet, whichever is more restrictive. But projects that are over that amount would still be entitled, if they're within the missing middle unit range, to the streamlined regs, as long as they provide a drainage plan that documents and shows that runoff from the property will go into public right-of-way or a dedicated drainage easement. And finally, there's a variety of other amendments that will be available to talk about. We've proposed changes that would allow the Board of Adjustment to grant limited setback and height reductions for projects that are attempting to provide significant housing capacity but are experiencing limitations due to things like utility easements, drainage easements, other sorts of impediments. And we have a variety of other text revisions that will be available to talk about tomorrow. And please feel free to reach out to us as well if you have questions or concerns about any of the amendments or how we've sought to implement them. So with that, turn it over to Lacey Patterson.
Hello, I'm Lacey Patterson with the Planning and Zoning Department on the Land Development Code Revision Team. I'm going to cover 3 topic areas in relation to first reading mapping amendments today, and those topic areas are transition area reductions, additional missing middle mapping, and then other non-missing middle mapping amendments. So first, I'm going to discuss the changes that were made in vulnerable areas as identified by UT's uprooted report. Per direction, where transition areas were applied in the October 4th first reading map, and areas that were considered or are considered as early type 1 and susceptible per the uprooted report, we have in this map the new second reading version applied R2. And in areas that are designated as R3, where there was R4 application in the first draft or in the October 4th first reading map, we have applied R3 as part of this second reading map that was just released. In areas considered late, the R4 mapping has remained the same as in with areas considered continued loss. Additionally, this direction was emphasized as an overarching policy that any additional transition zones should not be placed in any areas identified in the uprooted study found as being susceptible, early, or dynamic. All additional mapping of missing middle was done with this consideration in mind. So next I'd like to show a couple of examples. Here on the screen on slide 6 we have an example of an early or susceptible transition area that was originally mapped as R4, now being proposed for R2 in this next second reading iteration. Next example, as you can see on the left, is the first reading map that was released on October 4th that shows 2 lots of R4, and this being an example of a dynamic transition area. Now in the map you see on the right is the second reading version that has R3, and it's a bit difficult to differentiate between the colors, but the black outline shows where R4 was on October 4th versus where R3 now is in this next iteration. So next I'm going to move to another area of missing or transition area mapping reduction, and we're going to look at an example of areas that are corridors that are considered primarily residential. And in those areas that are considered, those corridors that are considered as primarily residential, as directed in first reading, the transition areas are reduced so that this reduction is defined by adjusting the transition area depth methodology to count the corridor lot as the first lot in the transition. Overall, for each residential corridor, this results in a single lot depth reduction as defined by the transition methodology. At times, this does result in more than one lot being mapped as R2 that was previously mapped as R4. As shown in the slide 8 right here, you can see another black outline showing where on the first reading map there is a lot depth further of R4 that is being proposed as R2, and a reduction of RM1 that isn't outlined but is being proposed as R4. Another area of reduction is the local flood problem areas, but we will come back to discuss that momentarily. So next I want to talk about areas where missing middle was added in this map. There was a first reading directive to increase the supply of missing middle housing in high opportunity areas. The list of criteria were considered that is on this slide, and we're going to talk about those today. First, I'd like to talk about how R4 was mapped in and near activity centers by examining properties that were within 1/8 of a mile of these centers. And I'd like to note that just as with mapping transition areas, we looked at lot orientation, block configuration, and access to these centers. Also, in this mapping of additional R4, we provided more missing middle near grocery stores, as they're also often in proximity to our centers and our corridors. The other criteria listed on this slide, first I'm going to go into mobility funded corridors. We reviewed these corridors that are planned for investment with the 2016 regional and corridor bond programs. We reviewed properties that are within a 16th mile area along these corridors with the same attention to lot and block orientation and access to the corridor. Once again, it's not seen on this slide, but there is a grocery store that is near this area and thus is part of the capture of missing middle mapping. These other criteria listed on the slide, parks, schools, and corner lots, I will come back to momentarily. But first, I do want to discuss mapping amendments that are outside of missing middle mapping. So the first one I'd like to cover is the mapping of UC in centers, where we were considered to rezone some Highland tracts and other activity centers to UC and apply transition zones. We did, as also directed from the text side of the first reading amendments, create a UC 60 zone, meaning it's UC with a 60-foot base, and an increase in entitlements comes through participation in the Affordable Housing Bonus Program. This UC zone, which is this lovely pink on the slide, is applied in 3 regional centers. The Lakeline Station Mall, which is represented on the left, the Highland Mall Station, which is represented on the right, and then not shown here, the South Central Waterfront Regional Center. The other regional centers already have a regulating plan of some sort applied, such as you can see here, there's PUD zoning right next to the in the Lakeline Station. There's PUD regulating plans in our other regional centers. And we did reserve UC for regional centers only. So our next amendment was to examine additional mapping of increased entitlements to maintain housing capacity in regional centers and to review properties that are undeveloped or greenfield areas. What we have here on this slide is the breakdown of zoning designations that we found on properties that are currently undeveloped in centers. It is a mix of zoning, and what we've found is that roughly 50% of the acreage that is undeveloped in our activity centers are currently zoned for PUD. The rest is a myriad of different zoning designations, but I do want to call out the 8% that is zoned for R2 and RR. We are going to continue to discuss the possibilities for increased capacities in these areas prior to third reading. Next, we did examine special districts, state and publicly owned lands to find out what current zoning is in these areas. The chart on the left shows state and federal land and the breakdown of proposed zoning designations, and 60%, roughly 60% of the acreage in these special districts do comprise, or of the state and federal land, do comprise of unzoned land, public zoned land, and PR zoned land. So it's over a majority. In our special districts, which includes PIDs and MUDs and some other areas, but not school, just more specialized special districts, we have a breakdown of, again, where about 50 to 60% of the special districts have PUD zoning, and the breakdown from the other zoning designations is a variation between all of our zoning designations. We do not recommend changing the approach of comparable zoning at this time due to the complexity of zoning governmental uses, and we feel that this should any change in zoning should be done through a separate intergovernmental process. Next, I'd like to talk about development reserve. We are not recommending that development reserve be incorporated into the revised land development code because its basic purpose can be achieved through other more flexible zones. In some respects, DR is similar to an interim zoning designation. And what we have here on this slide is also from our staff report, and it's a breakdown of the development reserve properties and the 4 different proposed zoning designations you can expect to see on this map on properties that are currently zoned for DR. They include preserved land, existing public parkland, municipal properties, which are all zoned accordingly per those other processes to CL, BR, or P, and any other DR zoned properties have been given an F25 designation. Next, I'd like to talk about the directive to right zone citywide existing missing middle housing, including triplexes and fourplexes. Upon further review, we intend to follow direction. However, if we are to apply R4 or R3 on existing fourplexes or triplexes, this could result in either an increase or a decrease in entitlements. In harmonizing the direction, we can continue to discuss the direction about right zoning and changing of entitlements on properties such as these. And lastly, coming back to our high opportunity missing middle zoning application, we reviewed the locations and the context around parks and schools and corner lots and have concluded that they're typically a very site-specific variability between them, and these features complicate the applications of new zones through comprehensive revision. So next, I'm going to hand it off to Matt Holland, who's going to discuss the local flood problem area changes.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Lacey. So one of the council directives was in the first draft first reading was to consider reducing the application of missing middle zones within local flood problem areas if warranted to mitigate the risk of drainage problems. And so staff actually has done a number of different things. I'm going to go through one of the key changes today that involves the map, and then tomorrow we'll be talking about some of the other important changes that really sync up things with your direction on graduated impervious cover and a lot of other important changes that you requested. So the concern again was that you have potentially have new residential units introduced into areas that already are experiencing local flooding problems. And so what we did is we did something very similar to what we did with the Atlas 14 dynamic. So as you recall, we had this bigger floodplain that we were responding to, and we wanted to make sure we weren't upzoning properties in floodplains, adding missing middle into floodplains. And so we've already done this. This was already part of the draft we came out with, the map we came out with in the fall. And so in this picture, this kind of cartoon, you can see that the floodplain has just white properties underneath it. Those blank properties, those are, instead of the missing middle kind of a continuing on across there, those were already taken out. And so in the case of these local flood problem areas, what we did was we had our flood engineering staff go in, and this is kind of a just idealized local flood problem area in the kind of the shaded gray there. And what we've done is put this dotted line. We had those folks, those engineers, went in and looked at the drainage ways, looked at the flow paths through each one of these 147 problem areas. They looked at those areas, and then they identified the downstream half of those flow paths. So you can imagine in a floodplain, the floodplains get bigger and bigger as you go downstream, and these areas, local flood problem areas, are by definition not in the floodplain. That's why they're called local flood and not creek flood. So they're upstream, but they also have accumulated drainage along them. And so we felt, out of an abundance of caution, as you would say, let's go ahead and eliminate the missing middle zoning within that lower half along the drainage ways. And so we looked at all those areas. A lot of them didn't have any missing middle zoning, or it wasn't along the drainage way. But we did identify over 300 parcels that we removed the missing middle from. and just left it as it would have been otherwise translated. So pretty straightforward. Again, we're trying to add a little extra margin of safety in these areas in the event that is a driver. So and again, we'll talk to you tomorrow about some other important changes we made for lot-to-lot flooding and so forth. And that's it.
That concludes our presentation on the mapping, and we're happy to take questions.
All right, so we have 35 minutes left in this section. There are 11 of us. Everybody gets basically 3.5 minutes. All right, Jimmy.
Just on the special districts question, you mentioned PIDs, but I don't think that was the intention. We were looking at specifically the districts that have elected officials that are more appropriately represented by the public. So limited districts and MUDs, but not so much PIDs. And I don't know if that would change the analysis or the recommendation. Just want to make that point first.
And that was 10 seconds, by the way.
Oh, did you? And this is a follow-up to what Councilmember Flanagan just asked. So in some areas with MUDs, we already have a request from the MUD elected board to change the proposed zoning to what matches what they have on the ground. So it would seem it seemed to me that y'all were recommending this should be done through an intergovernmental process. Well, in your mind, would the fact that the other governmental body has a certain use and they're requesting that we match it, wouldn't that satisfy that intergovernmental process? I mean, to be more specific, I've got 2 MUDs that have land that's used as park, and that's how it's designated within their elected body, and it wasn't zoned that way, and they're asking us to zone it that way.
Councilmember Kitchen, this is an issue that we can certainly continue to look at moving forward through second reading and on to third. However, at this time, we're really emphasizing the importance of having a very clear translation table that shows with minimum subjectivity how parcels are translated from one zoning category to another. And we're concerned that the more we have to get into the facts of a particular case, the facts of a particular situation, that is more appropriate from a best practices standpoint to be handled outside of the comprehensive revision process. But we understand the point you're making, and we're certainly available to continue looking at this issue. But at this time, that our recommendation is that any changes from the current approach for governmental properties be deferred until a later process.
Okay, I'd like to talk with you about that more because I don't understand what you mean by that, and also, we have a request from a governmental entity to match a current use on the ground. That's easy to translate. So if we're saying we need to put that off, then I would like to understand how long and when and exactly what that process is, and that's something I need to explain to these MUD boards. And so I would request that we have that information as part of second reading, so going into second reading I can explain that level of detail. Do you think that can be done?
Absolutely. We'll prioritize getting you a more thorough response on those issues.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, just 2 minutes. Leslie.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to emphasize the piece on the zoning on governmental properties. I think there was a conversation early on in our earlier Code Next conversations that zoning would in fact take place during the LDC rewrite, and so I want to double down on making sure that we don't have another situation where property being developed that was previously state-owned and so was unzoned, that we had protest issues and complications that could have been much easier. The development could have been proceeded much more smoothly if the zoning had been in place. So that piece, and then I wanted to, so emphasizing what Ann is asking for, and then Matt, I had a couple questions for you, and it may be that you'll talk more about this tomorrow, but I'd like you to describe the methods you used to determine whether a parcel would not be allowed more impervious cover in local area flooding problems. and ask whether you'd be continuing to examine areas and potentially add to your list of parcels that shouldn't get impervious cover. So essentially, are you done with the 300 parcels, or are you continuing to work? And then I want to point to the parcels in Brentwood that are in the red zone that the residents in Brentwood have been concerned about for almost the entire time I've been on council, and you've participated in a number of public meetings with them. It looks like virtually none of the parcels in Brentwood were scaled back, and there is a lot of known local area flooding. So I'd like to know where the parcels you removed are located and why parcels in Brentwood may not have been included on the list. Yeah.
Sure.
So essentially 2 questions other than a methodology.
Okay, so we are we have completed this phase where we're looking at those drainage ways and the properties along the low-lying areas. So we're not. I mean, we can
Specifically, like the Grover Branch, for example.
correct. If it was within one of the local flood problem areas, we did look at it and we did try to identify parcels that, and then we're immediately adjacent. Obviously,
Okay.
we would love to know if folks think we missed something, we could look at that. But we didn't have plans to continue the work as such. So we did back when we started. We looked at the impervious cover levels on each one of these areas, and I think we already presented about this, but the impervious cover levels were very modest in pretty much every one of these. The increases. If it had been spectacular, that would have been definitely a red flag. But we did not see that level. We are continuing to be extremely concerned and are introducing important changes for the lot-to-lot flooding component and also along these drainage ways. So we're hoping that was going to be that forward progress was going to be part of the new code.
Okay, that's great. And my staff and I will work with you further to identify parcels in Brentwood that we noticed had not been addressed but are subject to the lot-to-lot and that are the topic that the residents have been concerned about for quite some time. And then last, could you give me some details on the code language prohibiting the lot-to-lot flooding and the process for making that language more publicly accessible?
Sure. And so we have, so we already have as we presented earlier. We talked about the plumbing code, which applies to all of these single-family and missing middle projects. And so we're looking at ways to strengthen the plumbing code as well, and that's a separate process. It's actually not literally in the part of the code that we're changing now, but we're gearing up for that, and we're looking at process changes that are very important to make sure that all the departments involved are really ready for that. And then, as we'll talk about tomorrow, we have some important changes that talk about the how if a property is upslope of another property and is not able to get, as Brent mentioned earlier, very briefly, if that property is not able to get its drainage, to a safe location, and instead of like schlepping it through that downstream property, we're actually going to literally just tamp down the impervious cover and going to limit it to 50%. You will not be able to go up to 60 or 55. You will have to lower it down. So that was directly something we were looking at as a lot-to-lot drainage, and actually. Again, this is all stuff we'll go into more detail tomorrow. But we're going to be requiring, if you go above 50% impervious cover, you're going to be required to submit a formal drainage plan by a licensed professional, such that that drainage will be basically tracked through the property, from above, and then coming off, and you'll have to have diffuse flow off the bottom part of the tract. So those are the backbones of those.
That sounds great. I appreciate that, especially the lot-to-lot. That's a chief concern. And we'll continue to work with you.
Very good.
In
Thank
the
you.
coming days. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Leslie, that was 5.25 minutes. Craig.
Thank you all. I know you put in a lot of work so far. I just want to highlight for folks that are watching or go back and check this, just the important work y'all have done to address some of the issues in the uprooted gentrifying areas, but then our related direction that we still wanted to have a large amount of missing middle capacity, and so moving some of that missing middle capacity around the centers makes good sense to me. I think we'll keep on looking at all those centers and figuring out how to refine that best. But for example, one of the big centers in my district, the Highland Mall, y'all added that additional height and density there, And so I think sort of moving some of those pieces around while maintaining that missing middle, I think, was an important achievement that we're going to keep on working to refine, but I just think is important for folks to have seen and highlighted. If we wind up with some net reduction of missing middle that's mapped at the end of the day, I do think, I know this is outside of mapping, but us working on the buildability of that missing middle and making sure that the places we do map it, we really do get it, I think is also really important. So if we wind up with a little bit less, but we make it more easier to build, then I think that more than makes up for it. The three areas that I wanted to, really the two areas I wanted to highlight on this front were the university neighborhood overlay, the downtown area, and then also some of the triplex, fourplex, multifamily zoning. Looking at this, we mentioned please add more height in the bonus in the UNO area, and in the report it goes back and cites that council had previously voted not to do that, but council just voted in the direction to do it. So advise us if on second reading we need to go and vote again to do it, so that maybe 2 out of our last 3 votes would be to add the height in UNO. I just don't know, and if there's some issue with that, let us know. But when we voted to do it and the staff report said, well, earlier you said not to and now you said to do it, I think the latest vote should control. But if we need to vote again on second reading, y'all let us know. On the downtown area, I know stakeholders are working carefully and closely together to hopefully add more height and capacity in those areas without a density bonus, and I hear from folks that they're getting close to agreement on that, and hopefully we'll all hear back from them. But hopefully on second reading we can continue to make up for any lost capacity by adding some of the height, mapped some of the height there in downtown. And then similar to the UNO issue, I think it was Councilmember Tovo's triplex and fourplex amendment into the multifamily amendment. I know that our prior direction said generally don't downzone below the existing use, but I don't think that any of our amendments did that. Our amendments were to zone those 3 and 4 and multi-unit things to the existing use. So I don't think we're in conflict there from the May direction, and would love to hear as we get closer to second reading, do we just vote again to say, let's really do UNO, let's really do 15 years on the preservation bonus instead of 30. And if we just need to get rid of the word consider and just be more direct and say, go ahead and do it, then we can do it. And that just might mean on second reading, we're voting again on some of the same amendments we voted on first reading, just with really or without the word consider. In some of these cases, the word consider was included. So I know you just considered it. In some cases, the council said to do it, but you cited previous council action as to why not to. And so maybe if y'all just advise us whether we just vote on it again. But thank y'all for all of the hard work. I'm picking on 4 out of the 199. And so I know y'all did a lot of hard work on a lot of them, and just let us know when we have to revote.
Thank you. It's 3.5 minutes. I want to address the equity overlay just real quickly in the context of the larger community conversation. I go to a lot of places in the city, and there are a lot of people in the city that feel very strongly about the Land Development Code. And I hear almost without regard to which room I walk into a conversation about equity and about doing everything we can to ensure that all kinds of people have a chance to live in all parts of our city. What I tell people is that I am proud to be part of a council where I feel like every member on the dais has prioritized equity as part of this process. I think everybody is trying to achieve a similar result. It's frustrating sometimes to be in a room where, because somebody's way of achieving it is different than somebody else's way of achieving it, there's the suggestion that one or the other obviously isn't concerned about equity, and nothing I think could be further from the truth. I think we're all in search of that. The conversation we have about the equity overlay and pulling back some of the opportunity to be able to have density bonuses and affordability bonuses in areas that are experiencing displacement brings back to us the conversation that we've had as a council on zoning cases where that same equity issue has been present. I recognize that that if we upzone a piece of property in a particular area, we could be speeding dislocation for people that live there, and that counts against the equity goal. At the same time, I recognize that the more opportunities we have to have a dash A to be able to create affordable units and to add money, that increases the possibility that in 10 years from now we're actually going to have places where all kinds of people from all parts of our city and all kinds of circumstances are able to live there. And unfortunately, in a lot of these conversations as a council, we have this difficult choice because it's a forced choice. Do you do something that has an impact on people that are living there right now, or do you avoid that altogether, even if it means you're going to lose the opportunity to have people there 10 years, 15 years from now that might not otherwise be able to be there? I mentioned that I'm going to support the move we've made toward the equity issues that we've made in this, and I appreciate the work that the staff has done, and I'm going to support it. I will tell you that I'm going to support it because I think that it furthers equity. I will also tell you when I go to sleep at night and I look at this vote, there's part of me that is worrying that this vote done to further equity could have the exact opposite impact, and that somebody's going to be looking back at this council under 10 or 15 years from now and say, why didn't you maximize the opportunities to create permanent affordability in these areas? There is no right answer to this question. Both are goals that are born of trying to find greater equity. Each of us will prioritize and come from a different perspective on that. So there is a right answer probably for each of us and for people in the community. For me personally, I'm convinced there's not an absolute right answer to that. And I just want to emphasize that we are in search of trying to find equity, preserve opportunities for everybody to live in all parts of our city. And with that motivation and recognizing different people have different ways to get there, I think we're all trying to achieve the same result. Anything else before we move on?
Very quickly on the.
And by the way, I used 3 minutes and 45 seconds.
I'm not sure we're counting towards, but I'll be quick.
Roughly 3.5 minutes in each of these sections.
In each section? Okay. All right, so my question relates to the mapping around centers, just to make sure I'm understanding. So it was an eighth a mile from centers. Is that measured from where? The center of the center or the edge of the circle or where?
So we
generally speaking
lightly describe this in the staff report, but the mapping of the eighth of a mile is from access points within the center, aka intersections.
Okay. And is that it also says second criteria was access to the center. How is that applied? Is it the same way or
the same kind of way that when we were looking at transition areas, where if technically you were to do an as the grackle flies eighth of a mile buffer, and that property is within an eighth of a mile, but it's actually a cul-de-sac and the road and the entranceway and the actual access from that property to the center is much longer than that eighth of a mile, we do not consider that having that same access.
Okay. So it's an eighth of a mile measured from access points which are considered to be intersections within the circle of the center.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else before we move on? Jimmy and then Alice.
Just to the point that you made, Mayor, I do think we all have different understandings of how we address equity. And I remain concerned that by reducing transition zones in areas, you're not actually affecting equity at all because people are being displaced with zoning that allows only one unit. By reducing that to the corridors, you further point the market to certain properties instead of letting it naturally occur to folks who are ready to sell, whose families don't want to live in that neighborhood anymore, who people have passed away without a transfer of generational wealth and other factors. But one thing is for sure is that doing nothing also. So I'm going to continue moving forward on this process. I feel like we're all making our compromises to try to get to a place where we can be comfortable. I'm less comfortable with some of these things, but still ready to move forward.
Thank you. Anything else on this, Allison?
Thank you. I wanted to ask about the Greenfields in the centers, and what I heard you said, and we had started some conversations because when we met before, we realized it hadn't been mapped. Can you tell me what the timeline and the process is going to be for looking at the greenfield? So you've identified that there are R2 within activity centers. So we have single-family zoning in activity centers, regardless of where they are, but they're in activity centers that we have an opportunity to upzone that are greenfield, so you're not displacing anyone, and yet we haven't upzone those. So what is the process moving forward to make sure that that happens?
Thank you for that question, Anik Baudet. We are happy between now and second reading to look at some options that might be, as Brent pointed out earlier, comprehensive and translatable with regards to our growth concept in centers, and bring back some options. And the first step, as Lacey pointed out, was to understand what is the universe, and we've identified it's about 8% of the acreage within those. And so now we'll be prepared to look at what is, for example, the surrounding zoning, what makes sense, and using zoning criteria to look at those areas and bring back some options for you all in our second reading presentation.
At the second reading presentation or the third reading presentation? Because I've heard both
we will
of those
see
today.
how far we can get for second reading, and if we haven't gotten that far, then we will do it before third reading in our next supplemental report.
And just so I have a sense of the magnitude of the numbers, we're talking about 500 lots. Is that what I read on the amount? How much? I mean,
Lacey can give you the specifics. She did it in acreage mostly, so it's by lot. She may have an estimate.
I do not have a lot specific estimation at this point in time, but the acreage is about 8%, and it's roughly, if I remember correctly, 200 acres or so, but we can get the more exact numbers as we continue this conversation.
okay. I just think that's potentially a lot of places which are already located in activity centers, which do not displace people, that we really should be looking at whether we want to be incentivizing and creating conditions where those are going to be single family. And we have, on the flip side, put missing middle in the middle of neighborhoods that already exist where people will be displaced. And I just think we need to be weighing these choices and these options. And I hope that we'll have that information for that. And it was 200 acres out of like this over 2,500 acres that were in there. Am I reading the chart correctly? Is that?
I do not have the
left-hand?
overall acreage.
Well,
That's
you have a left-hand, you have a axis that goes up to 3,000. Is that in acreage?
yes, that's acreage.
Okay, so it's 200 acres out of all of that that's in our activity center. So there's a really big opportunity there, I think, for putting missing middle or potentially even further density. We'd have to do that in a kind of a planning process, but I just think that's an important thing to note. And then I wanted to push a little bit further on how you determine the centers. And I'd like to understand what is the best way, because sometimes you just kind of did a circle and sometimes you did different shapes. And, for some of these, they don't make a lot of sense for where the boundaries are. And then sometimes they extend beyond and sometimes they don't. How do we think about it if we want to suggest different kinds of boundaries that, you can look at a map and say this is the access point, or you can be on the ground and really understand how the community flows and understand where those access points are. Because there are parts of, even on the maps in front of you, that have much more access. If you have to cross the highway to get to Anderson Lane Station, that's very different than being, right up next to MOPAC and being next to the activity center, but yet because the way you have drawn it, you've excluded it. But I'm not understanding how we as council members or neighborhoods who live and breathe in those activity centers, what is the process for us to be able to make that make more sense? I understand you had to come up with a rule, but as we're refining it, how do we make it make more sense?
It's a really good question. Council member, I would propose to sit down with the council members at one-on-ones, which we'll have between second and third reading, and look at the centers from y'all's perspective, as you know your districts, and see if we can come up with amending our general rule in a way that captures the reality, which we might find in talking to your offices, that there's a lot of similarities in how and how the areas have developed in certain patterns that would be replicable citywide, and I would imagine that is the case. So we'd be happy to do that between second and third reading.
Okay. Thank you. I may have more questions.
That was 5.5 minutes. Paige.
This is going to fall kind of in line with what council members Kitchen and Alter have been asking about the centers as well. I know I live in an Imagine Austin center that has hundreds more units right now than it had a couple years ago. And in looking at the map, was just trying to see there's some R4 that has been kind of zoned to that circle that goes into the residential neighborhood. But talking about access points, when you really look at some of those other locations and how you get to and from that activity center, I've been talking to Public Works and Cap Metro about creating crosswalks and ADA accessibility through there, and it seems to be more of like as the grackle flies, like Lacey was saying, instead of where you would actually have foot traffic to be able to cross there. So I want to kind of echo that I'm kind of seeing the same thing and wondering how that works, if we need more direction, or if that's something that can just be tweaked. And I noticed also there's a couple like the community centers through Circle C. They've just kind of asked for those to match because the uses are being used the same way. And there's one that I looked at just now that seems to have gotten like a residential zoning even though it's not being used that way. So I don't know if that's maybe more of a process question for us, if it needs to be a specific map amendment, or if that is something we can just kind of work offline with y'all. Have we kind of discussed how these programmatic changes might happen, if we need to take them offline, or if we need to bring those in a third reading amendment to make a community center not have a residential zoning?
I believe that's similar to somewhat to the special districts as well, that we need to, staff needs to talk about what that process might look like, land the plane on what we would recommend through this process and how we might recommend it, as Councilmember Kitchen pointed out, to handle the request if not in this process, and we'd commit to coming back to y'all at second reading with that information.
Okay. That would be really helpful. And then I think there's a couple spots, either maybe I just need to get on the ground and see what it looks like, or I don't know if it's a glitch, but I didn't know if those were things we could just kind of bring to y'all's attention offline to kind of see if it is truly kind of data got inputted in a weird way, or if it is something that we need to go in and say, look at this specific tract of land and change it.
Council member, I will say that properties such as these, the proposed zoning is a result of the current zoning on the ground, not the current use.
Okay.
So just to make sure that's a clarification as we're going through this. Maybe when things seem like an anomaly or don't seem like they're zoned appropriately, oftentimes it is because of the current zoning.
Okay. Would we be able to change that for use?
That's what we're going to talk
Or is that a council question?
We will talk about that, but there's definitely a need, to have a clear translation criteria, and so the more situations we get into where, in these circumstances it's zoned to the existing zoning, and these others it's zoned to use, it starts to get too complicated, and so there are definitely going to be some situations where there's every good planning rationale for going one direction, but it doesn't lend itself to a comprehensive approach that we're pursuing here. So we can, just as with the special districts and the centers issues, we can talk offline and see if there's some refinements that we can make. But I think there are going to be just some situations where we're confronted with the limitations of the comprehensive revision process.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, there was 3.5 minutes. Anne, you've used 3.5 minutes, so you're beginning to eat into your time for your remaining 2 questions. But go ahead.
That's fine. So, this is the only time I get to ask. So, okay. So, from the staff report, page 10, there's a reference to working more on issues related to context sensitivity and side setback compatibility. And there's just language that says that is something staff's still studying with an intent to recommend a revision. So I wanted to know the timeline for recommending the revision, and if that's something that we could see for second reading.
Yes, we actually will have some information on how we're developing a response to the transition areas where you have the more intensive corridor zones that are abutting on more than one side to an R4, for example, which is not a large geography across the city with regards to how we've approached the methodology for transition areas. And tomorrow we will, when we show the renderings of the different zones and the commercial zones, we can show that example and how we're thinking, and we would invite feedback from council on what we're thinking on that at that time tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that was only a minute. Pio?
Thank you, Mayor. What I want to know is the procedure. There's some properties in my district that, there's acres out there, but it's zoned. Right now, the way it's mapped, it's R2s. And I was just wondering, is there going to be an opportunity later on to really look and focus on some of these properties that, have the ability to put in more capacities of middle housing there? So how are y'all going to handle that section on it? If it's now it's just like our land that we have at the Pecan Hatchery there. We're never going to be able to build housing, low-income housing there if we're going to do it at R2s, and now we're going to have to build roads through there. It's going to be very expensive. And I was wondering, the residents around there will be willing to allow more density if we don't mess with the trees. So I was just wondering, and right now you have property like that, zone R2s, and I was wondering if there going to be any ability to rezone that property?
So as Lacey pointed out, for the most part, with the exception of the council direction and the comprehensive rules that we're applying to apply the new zoning and the new code, what you'll see on the zoning map is the translation from the existing zoning to the new zoning, which is probably what's happening in your district with an SF3, for example, that now has R2. And so what we would recommend is looking at the direction from May 2nd with regards to small area district planning. Next level planning would be the appropriate time to look at adding and changing and applying more zones that are the new tools we have in the new code in order to continue to provide for diversity of housing throughout the city. The code is not it's not static. As we're going to create the tools and we're going to apply it comprehensively with the map, and then we need to do next level planning to continue to refine using those tools that we've created. Did you want to add something?
Yes, and the other possibility that that could be considered is we've definitely had situations where properties would be R2 because that matches their existing zoning, but they're really large parcels, and they could, as you mentioned, accommodate more density, and one could make a case for giving them an RM2 or some kind of zoning that would be units per acre. And if council's interested in doing that, we would need to adopt a rule we need to be able to fashion a rule that could be applied citywide. So something like if it's a property that would translate to R2 under current zoning, but it's over a certain size, then it would get perhaps one of the RM2 or above zones. And if we could reduce that to a rule that we would apply uniformly, that would be something that could be considered. But the harder that gets, and the more we find that, well, in some areas that makes sense, in other areas it doesn't, then the more, as Anique was saying, we need to really look at pushing that off into a subsequent rezoning process.
Thank you.
Okay. Pio, that was 3.5 minutes. Leslie, everybody has roughly about 9.5 minutes between the three sections, and you can use your time however you want to. Leslie, you're just over 5 minutes.
So I want to talk a little bit about the North Burnett Gateway Regulating Plan on the mapping. And my staff and I have talked with the team leadership in the past on the opportunity in District 7 in the North Burnett Gateway area, which is an Imagine Austin Regional Center, and it was designed, as we all know, to be Austin's second downtown. I just wanted to let you all know I'll be offering an approach to treat this regional center as a test case for how to embark on revisions and updates of existing regulating plans and TODs, because I think we need to crack open that discussion. And the North Burnett Gateway is it's just a perfect area for that. We have talked about looking at our growth concept map and identified town and regional centers for appropriate places to identify density and community benefits and job centers. And this is the regional center. In my district, we've planned for the growth, and then we've got the 2 rail stations that will be coming online with the TIF, with the TIF resolution that I brought at our last, I think it was in November, to build 2 new rail stations. We've got 6 million square feet of new development happening at Broadmoor, which is just east of the Domain, right off of Burnett Road. And then, of course, just directly south of that, about a mile, is the soccer stadium. And so we need to be looking at that regulating plan and the tiers and TIF activity that we're area that we're going to be defining when we get those boundaries from our consultant. And I'm worried that if we wait, because that isn't reflected in the current map, even though we did talk about it, if we wait, we could miss an opportunity to capture the value of the transformative redevelopment that's occurring at a faster and faster rate. So I just want to put this back on your radar for the mapping. So the Domain area where Broadmoor is should absolutely be looked at for additional density. It can absorb density that maybe is not appropriate in other districts, not just District 7. And then also the tiers area, which is bounded by Broadmoor at the north and McCalla Place at the south. That includes Kramer Station, which we know is light industrial, and that currently is not being upzoned to the greatest possible potential on the maps as we've given. I did suggest that be looked at and scrutinized for that very additional development, because we know that area is going to develop really soon. So I don't really need a response to this, but I wanted to lay it out so everybody knows that there is a really active area in District 7 that's in the central north part of the city that was anticipated for this additional growth. We need to get that additional growth plan reflected in our maps. And I look for everybody's assistance in making sure that happens, because that's a benefit for the entire city. Thanks.
Okay, it was about 3 minutes. We ready to move on to the next presentation? Go ahead, Kathy.
Thanks very much. I have a couple, hopefully, quick questions. The first is, can you provide us with an update on when we might have available digital copies that we could print out maps from? I have a district that has hundreds and hundreds of impacted properties, and it's very challenging to use just the digital. And so we've relied on those paper copies. This time I know we didn't receive them. We are trying to get the digital files so that we can have those printed. And the last estimate I heard was, I think, not until Friday. So I didn't know if you had an updated information about when those digital files so that we can print out the maps might be available.
Councilmember, are you referring to digital PDFs or the digital shape files, such as the GIS shape file?
The digital PDFs. It's my understanding from working with the printer last time that they need a file in a particular format to be able to print them out, or just the printouts that you last time supplied to our offices. So do you have an intention of supplying us with a printout of our district? And then a second part of that, when are the digital files available so that we can take those and get additional copies of maps?
So the Friday deadline, or Friday turnaround timeline, I should say, does incorporate the creation of the PDFs themselves. That's unfortunately the most time-consuming piece of printing the maps. The printing's kind of the quickest piece. So we will we'll try to get you the digital PDFs as soon as possible, but I still don't know if I can promise earlier than Friday.
Okay, thank you. And then could you address, and I know we've talked about mapping in some specific ways. I have kind of the same question I've had all along. And from what I can tell in my initial review of our maps in the district I represent, District 9, it doesn't appear that there is a measurable change to the issue I've addressed several times, which is we had council direction that said 2 to 5 lots for a transition zone, and in multiple cases we have in excess of 5. as many, in some cases, as 17 lots rezoned. We've talked about the distance on one side or another, but I still haven't seen any meaningful change. So could you help me understand why it doesn't appear to be happening in other areas, but in the district I represent, why the transition zones are mapped well beyond the 5 that were directed by council?
Sure. Aniko Day, LDC revision team. The council direction on May 2nd gave us direction to look at generally 2 to 5 lots. And so we came up with a methodology based on planning judgment on how to reference the lots that should be included in a transitionary proposal that we then carefully came and worked through at various work sessions to receive feedback on. And that's been an iterative process, and we're open to continued feedback on that. And tomorrow we can have a slide or two and talk about that equitable approach again. But we read the direction to say generally 2 to 5 lots, which our methodology did start with that direction, and then we added some planning judgment and to look at how those reference points are realized in the map, and also because of the configuration of the lots. And so, in talking about them through an iterative explanation at the various work sessions that we did prior to October 4th, we were looking for more feedback and direction on that methodology. And we did receive some that we were able to pivot on. And so that's why you see sometimes more than 2 to 5 lots in some areas.
Frequently, and I would just say I don't think my feedback on this has changed, nor has the feedback from most of the people who live in these areas changed. And I guess I would just continue to underscore, if the council direction is 2 to 5, it's not at all clear to me why in some cases it's been tripled, and that doesn't seem to be happening anywhere else in town. And I don't understand it, nor do I think it's a rational approach, nor do I think the council direction supports it. So I guess that's my feedback for today. But I would also say, and make no mistake to those who are listening in the public, the conversation that we always had that was part of Imagine Austin was about densifying along the major corridors and in the major activity centers. It was not about going into the interior of neighborhoods. And that's exactly, and so not only was there a decision to create so-called transition zones in interior neighborhoods, then that transition zone span, in many cases, extends far beyond what the council direction indicated. So I appreciate that you went back and in a few cases changed from RM1 to R4, or we've lost one track, but it hasn't resolved what is a substantial issue throughout the neighborhoods I represent, and that's what, I guess that's my comment for today.
I'll just reiterate what Councilmember Tovo said. I would also say that I hear what you're saying in terms of some direction from council that has adjusted that. So, for example, the direction related to vulnerable areas recognized that the application of that rule citywide didn't make sense and also was counter to some goals. I would suggest that it continues to be counter to other goals. And, for example, we've had some conversation already about the fact that the just application of transition zones in the way that we've been doing, we're missing opportunities for increased density in areas like Councilmember Renteria mentioned, Councilmember Poole mentioned, because we're not doing a specific planning process to actually look at what's on the ground. Instead, we're taking a blunt approach that is not appropriate in some areas of town, which we've already recognized by pulling back on the vulnerable areas. It's not appropriate in other areas of town either. So I think it would behoove us to really think about that, as long as we get the tools in place to actually move more towards more density, which we're doing with the code. Do a starting point in terms of density with regard to the map, and have a very clear process for understanding where it makes sense, I think we can go beyond what we've achieved so far in terms of density. So I would just make that point, and I would ask my colleagues to really think about and allow for an opportunity for a process that really gets us closer to our goals.
Okay, that was about a minute 15. For me, I would say that I'm open to a conversation with respect to the transition areas. If I thought and it felt like it was enabling us to reach a much broader consensus on the council, recognizing that any conversation we have on that's going to be difficult because we run a spectrum on the council. But I will say that I am supportive when we look at the number of lots to reconcile the lots that are perpendicular to the corridors as opposed to the lots that are parallel to the corridors. And I don't think it's right for us to treat those the same because I think that much more important is the distance represented by the 2 to 5 lot, and I think that was the conversation that it's evolved to on the council when that question was brought back to us. That said, I'm willing to have the broader conversation on that issue.
Mayor?
That was about 2.5 minutes for me. Yes?
I hope that we can build space into our process to have that conversation. I think it's a critical one, and it's very, I know we're trying to limit our time and have been every time we've had these sessions to a certain number of questions. And we just can't really converse with one another if we have a pretty tight limitation on our questions. So I hope we can build that space in.
Sounds good. All right, let's move on. Yes, Councilmember Alder.
I just want to clarify something. So we're not getting printed maps until Friday. And when are we getting printouts of the over 1,000-page documents if we believe we need to read more than the Cliff Notes?
Also Friday. The
and
actual
we're
hard
voting
copies of the
on
code.
Tuesday? Is that correct? I just want to be clear, but that I'm understanding correctly, because I had thought we would have had them, sometime today, and I'm surprised to hear that we're not getting them till Friday. And I think that it's for those of us who do have constituents who are having their zoning changed with this map and are just hearing about it and whatnot, it's the timeline that we're on, and not having these materials makes it challenging for us to have the kind of substantive conversations that I think a code change of this magnitude merits. And I know that I may be in the minority in saying that, but I do need to acknowledge the conditions under which we're being asked to consider this material with the council meeting on Thursday.
There was a minute 45. Jimmy?
To be clear, though, it's all online.
Correct. The updated code, maps, and supplemental staff report, which serves as an executive summary, which is about 80 pages, looks like this, is available online. And then we will try to expedite the hard copies before Friday if possible. But as Lacey pointed out, the maps are a little more labor intensive than simply sending the PDF of the text to the printer. But we will get those delivered to y'all's offices as soon as possible, with the latest being Friday afternoon.
And the hard copies are just for council offices?
Correct.
So,
Correct.
Because I've already had members of my community download the online, provide their feedback. So I don't want there to be a misunderstanding in the public. The second draft stuff is published.
Correct.
It's just the hard copies for our offices that take time to print.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Kathy?
And I just want to be clear with the public that there are some areas in our city that are being relatively unchanged, and there are some areas that are being substantially proposed for very substantial changes. It is not possible for my constituents to get a clear sense of all of the ramifications, the very significant ramifications of the proposed mapping by looking at little square. It's certainly not possible for me to get a sense of the ramifications by looking square to square. But if you represent a district that has been proposed for extremely few changes, it certainly is possible to read them online. easily. So I look forward to getting those copies.
Okay, there was another 30 seconds. Let's go on.
And I just want to add that there's a need to understand the changes over time from the last draft and be able to explain that to people. And the comparison that we have is to the current to the proposed, which has its value. But if your constituents are trying to understand what changed and talking about how one area was hit harder versus another, and you have to be able to have a constructive conversation and explain that to them, it's really much more helpful if you have the three maps and you can actually point to things, and you cannot bring, it's very difficult to go to the neighborhood association if they don't have the ability to display things up there and have those conversations, or in office hours. It's just not as easy on that little screen for people who are not familiar with zoning.
Okay, there was another 45 seconds. Let's go now to housing capacity.
If we can pull up the presentation, we're actually going to go to the affordable housing bonus program next. Okay. We have Ian Carlton from Eco Northwest and Alex Steinberger. And Erica Leak is going to start off the presentation.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Erica Leak, Neighborhood Housing. So I am going to give a very brief update on council direction related to density bonus programs, and then Ian will provide a quick reminder about how density bonus programs are calibrated before we move on to Alex, who will provide information about capacity and where we are with that at present. So in terms of council direction relating to density bonus programs, the sort of most significant direction in this area includes direction about creating an equity overlay or an equity area, direction regarding vertical mixed use, the downtown density bonus program, and then a few other density bonus program changes. So relating to the equity overlay, one of the council amendments called for the creation of an equity overlay with boundaries that were created based on the uprooted report showing the areas that are vulnerable, have vulnerable populations. In that area, the idea was to try to preserve existing multifamily and create at least 10% of new units as affordable. So the way that we are attempting to implement that direction is by creating a new equity area bonus program that is defined by the uprooted report vulnerable area boundary. Within that boundary, there is a new bonus program, and in that bonus program, 10% of the units would be required to be affordable. And for any properties that are currently multifamily, council would have to approve those properties to participate in the bonus program, and that is an attempt to try to minimize the likelihood that those properties would be redeveloped. Additional direction, council direction related to VMU properties, or properties that were able to participate in the VMU program that we have at present. The way that we implemented those recommendations was to add a V designation to the zoning string for all of those properties. They would be required to have at least 10% of all of the units be affordable and on site, and the MFI requirements would be consistent with a citywide affordable housing bonus program, which is 60% median family income for rental units and 80% median family income for ownership. Right now we have VMU properties that have a variety of different income requirements. Downtown density bonus program changes. There was a recommendation to allow unlimited bonuses, unlimited height and FAR through a bonus program. So the proposal at present in the second reading is shown on the right-hand side. Basically all areas that were eligible for the bonus program at present, they would be allowed the additional unlimited FAR and height through a bonus program. And again, that allows us to maximize the affordable housing benefits of the program with following that council direction. And then other general bonus program changes that we wanted to make sure just everyone was aware of. We have renamed what used to be called the -A to -Q so that there was less confusion about the MU5A. So now it would be MU5A-Q if the property does not have residential entitlements at present. And when that is the case, there is a requirement that at least 10% of the, no, sorry, and now I'm confusing my programs. Then that means that all of the residential space would be considered bonus. So the important thing to note there is that what used to be called the -A is now called -Q for our alphabet soup. But we're also trying to make it really clear that if a property didn't have residential entitlements right now, that all of the residential space would be considered bonus. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Ian to do a quick reminder of calibration.
Good afternoon. Ian Carlton with Echo Northwest and a consultant to the LDC revision team. And I want to provide a quick recap of how bonuses function and then describe some of the work that we did to calibrate the bonuses in this second reading draft. So the first thing to remind ourselves of is the way that the real estate development process works is that development only occurs when there is sufficient land or sites available for development. The public policy allows that development to occur. There is adequate market demand and available capital to deliver those. If any one of those factors is insufficient, then development will not occur. When development can occur, it can generate value. And in this slide, we're depicting what value might be created through the development of a building under base entitlements. And the goal in a density bonus program is to offer greater entitlements that allow someone to create something that has more value. And that bonus value, that incremental value that is created, is what we then hope to capture in part through a public benefit, and in this case, an affordability benefit. That benefit can come in the form of on-site housing, or in some cases in the form of the payment of a fee in lieu, off-site delivery, but an affordability benefit that is generated out of the value contributed by that new bonus offered to development on a site where all those factors are present. Now, when we capture that public benefit, we're leaving a certain amount of value available to the person or the investors who are delivering that bonus building. And so long as that bonus building is creating more value than they would generate under the base, we would expect them to pursue the bonus option, which allows for the delivery of those public benefits that we desire, the affordable units, the fees, etc. And so there are cases where if we were to require too much benefit, we were to capture more value than the bonus generates, then the bonus would end up having less value than building under the base entitlements. And in this instance, we would expect that we would see the delivery of a base building, a building built under base entitlements, because it generates more value than a building built under the bonus entitlements while capturing that amount of public benefit. There are also cases in this market where delivering more units and more, for example, office space on a site does not generate more value. It may be financially infeasible to build a larger building on a given site, given the market dynamics, the cost of construction that might be higher for a more expensive building, by going from surface parking to structured parking, for example, to be able to build something that uses the bonus entitlements. So we often say that you can zone for Manhattan skyscrapers in Manhattan, Kansas, but if the market does not exist to deliver it, it will not happen. If there is not a market to deliver a bonus building, we will see base buildings built or nothing built at all. Now, our goal with calibration is always to try to right size the bonus and the requested public benefit so that the bonus entitlements offer a benefit and they are taken more often than not. And in that way, we get the delivery of those public benefits in the form of affordable units, in the form of fees at times, but that we generate public benefit through that bonus. It's a balancing act, and that's what we're depicting here, is this balance that we're trying to play out, and we're trying to run calculations to better understand what might happen. So to put this into practice, we conducted a calibration for the citywide program, and we revised our calibration from the last time you saw one for the first reading to reflect the changes in the zones that were produced. And so we want to remind you that these calibrations are really targeting that 60 and 80% of AMI household generating units in market rate buildings to address just one piece of the overall housing need that Austin has identified through the housing blueprint. Now, to accomplish this, remind you that we incorporated the bonus program into the code, into each zone where it was feasible, and we incorporated the bonus program in the mapping to the maximum extent possible. And then we calibrated it based on market-specific attributes so that in one market where there might be bonus value, we might be able to capture more affordable public benefit. And in other areas where perhaps the market is weaker, we may not capture as much benefit and we may not require as much. And so we have different requirements for different market areas. So as we calibrated the citywide program, again, we were looking to measure the base compared to the bonus to understand how much public benefit we could request in each geography. This is an example of the outcome of this calibration. This is a zone MU1-Q. So quick reminder, this is the new designation for what was formerly -A. So in this zone, there would be only bonus units. So this percentage requirement would apply to all units in this geography. So in this particular case, what you see here are different colors on the map. Those are different requirements. If you are seeking to build in central Austin in the pink area, you'll be required to deliver more affordable units if you're building in an MU1-Q zoned property than if you're in the light yellow geography trying to deliver a building that uses the bonus in an MU1-Q zoned property. And to understand the differences here, I'd point to the orange, which is both within the hatched area and just to the west of it. That orange is a 10% requirement of all the units in a building. That 10% requirement reflects two things. One, the market geography can support a 10% requirement, as well as the equity area program, where we have set a floor of 10% requirement for a zone like this. And in those areas where there's a 10% requirement, what we're saying is that one affordable unit would be cross-subsidized by 9 market rate units. So it would require 9 market rate units to be delivered to cross-subsidize that one affordable unit. That's 10% out of all the units, for this to be feasible for a developer to deliver the bonus, for them to deliver in a dash Q any units at all. And in some cases, developers may want to opt out of this, and so in the citywide program, there is a provision for the payment of in lieu fees, and these in lieu fees are unit specific. So if a developer opted to pay an in lieu fee instead of delivering a required one-bedroom unit, they would be asked to pay $180,000 in lieu of delivering that affordable unit. That is calibrated to the cost for NHCD to basically take that funding and go buy an equivalent one-bedroom unit that can be affordable somewhere in Central Austin. So they're being asked to basically, instead of building it on site, to pay for it to be delivered elsewhere. Now, we also conducted a calibration of the fees for downtown and the University Neighborhood Overlay, or UNO. And in these areas, there are base entitlements that are related to the LDC zones, but there are very distinct bonuses. These bonuses relate to these plan areas and do not correspond to the bonuses you would find in the standard LDC zones. So this calibration related to the fee that someone might be able to pay to opt out of delivering units on site or to be able to access the bonus if they're building a commercial property. And so these two areas are in Central Austin. These are strong markets, delivering a lot of units and a lot of space today and anticipated into the future. And so when we were calculating the base and the bonus, we saw that in these areas there was an opportunity to take the bonus and that it had value and that we could capture public benefit from these. And so we looked at that base versus bonus to calibrate a fee that someone might pay while still ensuring that there was enough value left on the table for them to almost always take the bonus. We want them to always deliver that bonus because when they deliver that bonus, they deliver all those public benefits that come with it. We also had to determine what the optimal geography was to define these fees. So these fees currently are defined based on 3 geographies in downtown and across all of UNO, but we were asked to explore whether it would be better to define these fees in a more specific and nuanced manner based on base entitlements or the bonus entitlements, which vary by geography. This is a map of UNO and all of the different heights that are offered in the bonus program within UNO. And so we explored whether it would be appropriate to have a different fee for each bonus height, because again, we're looking at that base versus bonus value and how much one could ask for in public benefit. So the result of this was the definition of a set of recommendations for residential properties to pay a fee and for commercial properties to pay a fee to access the bonus. And in this case, on the residential side of the equation, it is to opt out of some of the affordable units in UNO, some of the affordable units in Rainey, and all of the affordable units in the rest of downtown. And so these fees were ultimately calibrated based on some sensitivity testing to what the base entitlements were in downtown and in Rainey. So we found that based on your base entitlements, you could pay a different fee. And then in UNO, we, balancing specificity, simplicity, and legibility of the policy, we landed on one fee in UNO. And you'll see that in UNO, that is one fee across the entire geography. And there are actually more than 60 distinct base and bonus pairs, but in our calculation, we think that one simplified fee, as it exists today, is the best path forward. So that concludes our presentation on the bonus program changes. And I think we're going to take questions now.
I'm going to go ahead and start, and I note that I have 5 minutes and 45 seconds for questioning remaining today. I appreciate this work, and I think we have to get really good about calibrating so that we actually get our tools used. Doesn't do us any good to have tools if we're not actually using them to generate housing that the market would not otherwise produce. And it's a shame that in the state of Texas, our state legislature does not give cities the ability to really do everything that a city might do in order to be able to generate in the marketplace greater affordability. But with the limited tools we have to make sure that we use them wisely and well. And again, I would urge us to make sure, from my mind, it would seem to me that we should have that expertise on staff and that we should annually or by regular schedule recalibrate to make sure that our policies are reflective of the market to ensure that they're used. And I'm sure that's a big conversation we'll have at budget, if not before budget. I do want to focus on the use of the word that you used when you said more value. So the whole theory is that as we get more value with greater entitlements, we can capture some of that more value that otherwise would have gone to the property owner or to the developer to get community benefits paid for. And I know we're using kind of a club as opposed to a scalpel because we have to come up with general rules. But when we say more value, I would imagine we're not just looking at absolute value, that we're also looking at investment yield. Is that right?
That is correct. We're assuming that it has to be competitive to attract capital to both a base building as well as a bonus building.
So
Correct.
make sure that I understand this, because we talk about value, but we don't often talk about yield. And I think sometimes I find myself in a community talking past one another because of the question about yield. An investor that comes in that wants to put capital against a development is going to be looking for a certain yield, a certain return on the money. If they take their money and they put it into a savings account, they're going to want to get 1.5% or whatever that is. If I take my capital and I put it into something that's really risky and I could stand to lose it, then I'm going to want a much higher rate in order to be able to invest in that. I'm going to want 10%, 15%, 20%, 30% return if I'm being asked to do a risky investment. The market sets what those returns are based on hundreds of people offering their capital. So in the market we have in Austin, if somebody's building a 3-story multifamily building in a certain part of town, it has a certain risk associated with it. There's a certain return that I would expect to get. And that person is going to receive offers to potentially invest in 5 or 6 different multifamily properties, but the return that's being offered to the developer is going to be basically the same, because if the return is too low, those builders are never going to get anybody to invest. If it's too high, they're going to find everybody wants it, and somebody's going to offer their capital at a lower amount in order to be able to get it, and that's how the market will get us to a certain yield. So if I have a project that has 3 stories and the yield that's set by the market is 7%, if you give me the ability to do an additional floor on my building, requires me to bring additional capital to the deal. Now when I bring additional capital to this deal, that means I'm not bringing it to the other offer that I had to build a multifamily tract down the street. Now, I know I can get a 7% return on the one down the street. So if you're asking me to put more capital in this deal, I want at least that same 7% return, or I'll put my money down the street. So you have to calibrate this in such a way that the investment yield stays constant. Don't let somebody get a higher yield on their dollars when they go the additional floor, because then you're paying them more than what they would have gotten for their return. But what you're trying to calibrate to is to make sure when you say capture some of that more value, it's not just absolute dollars. It's just not the developer makes more money if they build another floor. You have to get for that developer a similar yield to what the return was for that investment to start off with. Is that correct?
That is correct. In our math, we are assuming that the yield required by investors is similar for building a base building compared to a bonus building in a similar location.
Great, thank you. I have 30 seconds left. Anne, I have you with 3 minutes left in these last two sections.
All right, I'll be quick. So I want to ask about mapping existing affordable housing. My understanding is that we're mapping it based on current entitlement, not based on what's on the ground. And I'm assuming that that's the case all across the city. That's my question, including in the equity area.
That is correct. Yes.
Okay. So my concern is that we're not really preserving affordability that way. Because, and I'd like to ask for information about how many of our existing multifamily affordable housing, and I know you guys have identified them based on the data that you have, how many of them have current entitlements that are higher? Because I'm wanting to understand how many of them are at risk for being redeveloped. So then my question is, under the equity area overlay, one component of is the last bullet, which is to preserve existing multifamily. You're suggesting that it comes back to council for approval to participate in the bonus program, but I'm not seeing that as. Well, first off, I would think that why wouldn't we do that all over the city, since we want to preserve existing multifamily all over the city. But the second question I have is, how does that actually preserve existing multifamily when we are zoning existing multifamily according to current zoning, not to what's on the ground? So how does this help us?
So the rationale for requiring city council approval is that it means that there would be a public process when existing multifamily might be seeking to participate in a bonus program. So that public process is an opportunity for potentially neighborhood groups to be able to have discussions that the city can't have.
But that's not really my question. I'm sorry. Let me be more specific. How does it help when in a situation where that existing affordable housing already has a higher entitlement and we're zoning based on that higher entitlement as part of this process? Because they wouldn't have to come back to us, right?
Yeah, that is correct. Sort of depending on what entitlement they have and what is developed, and so I think this goes back to the discussion about can we. I think this is perhaps a discussion that the law department would like to have with council.
I'd like to have this discussion, and maybe it's an executive session. I don't know, but I'd like to understand what my colleagues think. Basically, the concern that I have is if we're zoning comparable zoning based on current entitlement, not based on the fact that a property is a multifamily affordable housing, we're not protecting that property as continuing multifamily housing. So I want to make sure that we use every option that we have, and I'd like to know what my colleagues think. I know Councilmember Kassar has mentioned this too. In our housing meeting the other day, we teed it up as a conversation. So I don't know what the best way to have that conversation is. I don't know if it's an executive session conversation or when to have it, but I'd like to have that conversation, because if there are some options that the council can act on to preserve those areas, then I'd like to take them. If they're not options for us, I think we need to understand them, because what we are saying as a council is that we're protecting affordable housing, and we are not in all cases doing that.
Got it.
So are you going to let me know when we can have that conversation?
Right, and we have several work sessions. We have a work session, maybe that's something to tee up. I don't know that it needs to be an executive. I just don't know. we're, and staff needs to be keeping a cumulative list here. There were some other things that Councilmember Poole put on the message board that she wanted to make sure that we had a chance to address.
Okay.
And if we're not addressing those today, let's make sure that we build in time to do that.
Okay, then the last point is,
Real fast, because you've gone over your time.
well, as part of that, then that fourth bullet was asking, why don't we, if we're applying this for multifamily properties in the equity area to preserve them, I would like to suggest that we should apply that all over town.
Got it. Thank you. Jimmy.
On the development risk yield stuff that the mayor was laying out, another factor that I've experienced with some new developments in my district is the developers coming in having a certain type of product that they build that is much smaller than the entitlements that are granted on the site. And when I've spoken to them about, have you thought about maybe having some more units? It's walking distance from a train station, even in my district. Like this is what we build. So there's more, Mayor, you said that the yield should be zero, but I would argue that the difference in yield between base and bonus, where you should capture all of it, I would argue that you actually can't capture all of it because the risk changes depending on the nature of the product, depending on the nature of the developer. And it gets almost more complicated than you can really nail down. But I've certainly seen, certainly in our suburban areas, where these suburban apartment complex developers come in, they have a product, they build it, they move on. And part of their willingness to do that is because they've streamlined all of their development processes and all the things, and they get their capital in, they get the capital out really, really fast. And in some areas, we're asking developers to come up with a new product, or we're asking developers who build these products in other cities to come to our city and try to learn a new process in a new community with higher risk. So I think we have to be careful about actually getting these products on the ground.
And my point was even more important than total dollars was yield.
Sure.
But you're right.
Right.
The actual yield has to be preserved as variable.
And I also think we have to be careful not to think of zoning as a preservation tool. Unless we're talking about historic zoning, which is different. We have properties today who gentrify without a change in zoning. So right sizing or matching zoning to use does not prevent gentrification. It doesn't prevent turning over of a property. It's more nuanced about market dynamics of the land and the space and the proximity to assets. We see single family homes turning into McMansions. That's why all this McMansion ordinance happened over the last few years. We see apartment complexes turning into luxury apartment complexes without increases in entitlements. And if we aren't really careful, we could actually get no bonuses anywhere and a lot of luxury houses and exacerbate gentrification. So it's a tough conversation to talk about redevelopment means more affordability, but when you're able to do it with a calibrated bonus, you can actually get there. And I think that's what we're trying to get, because today's condition is not viable. Change is inevitable. And our long list of predecessors 20 and 30 years ago on these councils didn't have as much data to prove that point as I think our community understands now. But I worry about trying to use this process as a tool to preserve existing construction when I don't know that that's a doable act. One question for you all. Is there a calibration difference we should be thinking about when it's a dash Q versus a bonus without a dash Q? Is the calibration different if we're talking about total percent of units on a whole site because we've added units to a commercial property, or if it's just like the fractional unit of a third floor, or should the calibration be different?
Yes, it generally should be, and it generally is. But
is that a nuance that's being worked out, I guess, is a better way to frame that?
yes.
Okay.
So sort of if we put the equity area aside, then the calibration, we actually have different affordability requirements for properties that have the dash Q than those that don't have the dash Q.
That's great. That's good to clarify. Thank you.
Okay, it's 4 minutes. Kathy.
I want to clarify something about transition zone zoning. So with R4, if you go to 8 units, from 4 to 8, there's an affordable housing contribution. It was my understanding when you went from 6 to 10 in RM1 that one of those units needed to be on site. Is that no longer true? Is there a fee in lieu option for RM1 zoning?
So
That was not a regulation in the RM1 or R4 from the beginning. But now it would be in the equity program area.
Okay, so I think
But that wasn't the original regulation.
So I misunderstood that on the first round. I thought if you built 10 units in RM1, that one unit needed to be built on site. So it does not.
No.
And so I just want to signal that I believe we should change that. I'm not sure why we would prohibit fees in lieu in the equity area and then in high opportunity areas allow for fees in lieu to be used rather than creating that housing in our high opportunity areas. That just doesn't seem to be sensible to me. I don't know if there's a response as to why we are not requiring. I mean, number one, we are doubling or tripling the base entitlement, so we're already losing the opportunity to capture some of that value. So lots that currently can build only 2 units can build 4 or 6 with no affordable housing contribution. And I'd like us to spend some time in this next week really relooking at that. I had an amendment. I don't believe there were any changes in response to it. It got significantly watered down in what we passed, but I don't see any measurable change in our affordable housing contributions to really recognize capturing that value from current zoning to what the entitlements would be in that transition zoning after the fact. But it really concerns me that in addition to losing that opportunity to capture some value, we're also not requiring that one unit to be built on site in high opportunity areas.
The challenge that we always have and will continue to have, though there was an amendment that may help with it to some extent, is when you have individual affordable units throughout the city, it is much more challenging to monitor those. There is an amendment that has been included in the code that said if there are 3 or fewer affordable units that they should be managed by an entity that is certified by the city. So I think that could help with that. It is just much more challenging and much more time intensive. But I think that's a discussion for council.
So why would it be more challenging to maintain and monitor that unit in a high opportunity area versus in the equity overlay?
No, not the difference between those two areas. Just small numbers of affordable units anywhere are a challenge to monitor because the amount of time it takes to train the people who are renting those units to make sure that they have all their records in line is a very time intensive process. So no difference between where they are, just in general.
So why are those two areas being treated differently in terms of the fee in lieu versus the on-site? I mean, I would think in the areas that are potentially have more expensive housing costs, it'd be even more important to have that unit available on site.
So the on-site requirement was part of the amendment, was part of the equity overlay amendment. I mean, that's the only reason they're being treated differently.
And so, again, I think that we need to revisit this, and obviously we're out of time, and probably I don't have time to ask our consultant the question of whether there isn't more value to be captured if you're looking at sites that in large part can construct 2 units on, and we are allowing them to construct 10. Can we not capture more benefit for affordable housing than what we currently have in this code? And given that in a lot of cases it's going to be replacing housing that is much more attainable than what's about to come, I think the requirement to have an on-site is really critical.
Okay. That was 5 minutes. Allison.
Did you have an answer to that? Because I have the...
We did a calibration specific to each individual zone citywide for each submarket geography. And in each case, we tried to optimize the percentage of affordable housing that could be required. And so for each zone, we feel like we have tried to right-size the requirement to optimize the number of units that could be delivered out of any given zone, be it missing middle, large scale, in any zone that has a bonus in the affordable housing bonus program.
But wouldn't we optimize it even further if we captured the units beyond that represent new entitlements?
I'm not sure I follow. I mean, by using the word optimize, I mean that we have tried to take into account all the factors present in the code as defined and maximize the amount of affordable housing that we could request from developers in each subgeography for each individual zone.
You're nearing the end
Yeah.
of your time.
So I would also, I'm still concerned about this and what we're doing with these bonuses, particularly in the high opportunity areas, and if it works in the equity areas to do on-site where you're going to get a higher, I'm not understanding the math why it doesn't work in high opportunity areas. So I'd like to know that. And then I'd also like to understand why is it that we're requiring that you come to council to use the bonus? Won't that just deter people from even accessing the bonus?
So to answer the first question, I think that we will address the feasibility of requiring 10% in the Dash V and in the equity program area momentarily, because our analysis shows that in some cases that is not, in our math, viable. And so in some cases it will not happen, though there may be cases where it would in the Dash V and in the equity overlay areas.
Where
And
what
so
won't happen? Sorry, I'm not.
the delivery of a bonus that requires 10%. And so we'll get more into that momentarily. And then for the second part of your question, I think, Erica.
Yeah, so the part of the question about, if someone has to come to council for increased entitlements, wouldn't that be a deterrent? And absolutely, it could be. It is also something that we have heard from community members as wanting to have an opportunity to weigh in as part of the process. It's in some places there are groups that are not council that can make agreements with developers for entitlements for community benefits that aren't necessarily those that are required through a program. So
isn't that true though throughout the city?
Sure.
So I mean, if we think that's a good, I'm just, there's some pieces here on what we're doing on multifamily and what we're doing on the bonuses that are just making me very uncomfortable about whether we have actually got all of our economics in order. And I'm not sure whether that's good or bad if they can come and do that. There's something missing here.
And so the question is sort of in the equity area or not. And I think one of the things that we thought as staff is that we would need additional direction to make that be a city-wide requirement. So there was language in the equity overlay that seemed to make that clear. If that's a desire citywide, then I think we would like to see that as additional council direction.
Councilmember Carr.
And on that point, I want to note that when the Mayor Pro Tem put this amendment up in the first place, she did mention that if that extra height over existing multifamily being discretionary as opposed to by right wanted to be citywide, that she would be supportive of that. And I think in my message board post, I mentioned that I would be supportive of that. And so this is a conversation that we had on the message board, and I would support that amendment to say that it's not in every case. It's just in cases where somebody is knocking down existing multifamily, that we want to take those case by case. As the mayor said, they're going to be different in different cases. In some cases, you might actually get more affordable units than you lost. And in other cases, it may not make good sense. And so this wouldn't hinder the capacity. It would just add an extra step when you're talking about knocking down already dense apartments. And so if we wanted to make that provision apply to the entire city, I've already indicated, and I think the Mayor Pro Tem already indicated, we're fine with that. I do want to point out that I think there is reason from the amendments that we passed as to what is going on in these vulnerable areas. It's areas that are overwhelmingly renters. It's areas that are overwhelmingly communities of color, and it's areas where you have really, really rapid change or are about to get that level of change in a way that people are losing a sense of home, and oftentimes that was caused by redlining that depreciated values in those places, and now we all know about it. We don't have to talk about it, but there is reason for us to be especially thoughtful there, and I think that having on-site units in those areas is important, so that as that development occurs, because regardless of what we do here, there's going to be development that occurs, still having those affordable units there is an important value to the community as those places face gentrification. And so for me, when you have lower levels of home ownership and you have those things happening, I just think that it makes sense to think of those areas differently. And I'll continue to advocate for that. But I do think that there are some parts of this that make sense citywide, and the multifamily issue raised by Councilmember Kitchen and others here in the last round here makes sense to me for us to be looking at those issues across districts.
If I could just clarify, I'm not sure whether it's good or bad. I think there's some pluses or minuses of this process. We're trying to simplify the code, and now we've just said you have to come to council when we were trying to make people not come to council. And I'm trying to understand the logic, and I can see that there's pluses and minuses. I just want us to be clear on what we're doing and if it should apply or not apply, but I'm not advocating one way or another at this point. I'm just trying to understand it.
Let's go ahead and hit the third category. That'll leave us about 15 minutes for questions on anything.
And this should be actually fairly short. So,
okay.
Good afternoon, council members, Mayor Adler. I'm Alex Steinberger with Cascadia Partners, part of the consultant team working on the LDC revision. And getting right to the punchline here, compared to the October 4th draft of the LDC, which we estimated to have a housing capacity of 397,000 units. This round of revisions has yielded actually a range. And the reason why we're presenting it to you as a range is because there are policies included in this draft that we wanted to present two potential outcomes from. So by that I mean the Dash V program that we discussed earlier and the equity bonus area program. And so I'll get into this a little bit more, but just to summarize right off the top, the resulting capacity could be as high as 410,000 units, which is actually an increase from the October 4th draft. However, if some of the economic modeling that we've done bears out, it could also be as low as 351,000, which is less. So I'll discuss a little bit more about why that is in just a moment. But first, let's just start with just a high-level explanation of the differences between October 4th and the January 31st draft. So you've all heard today about changes to mapping, and you've heard about changes to the bonus program, and you've heard about these new policy ideas, the Dash V and the equity bonus program. And because those things are changing, there is a significant difference potentially between those two versions of the code. In terms of mapping, not that much changed. There was direction to, as you heard from Lacey, move some of the missing middle zones and change some of the location of those, but the bigger impact here was the equity bonus program and the Dash V. So we provide you with two bookends of what that could produce. On the high end, we assume that in all those areas where now the requirement for an affordable housing set aside is 10% of all units, that works in any situation, regardless of whether the economics of it don't actually make sense from our perspective. And then on the low end, we actually modeled it as we have before, and any location, and that includes within the equity bonus geography, where a 10% set aside does not work, we assume that the bonus would not be taken advantage of. So that's what caused the difference in capacity. So what does that look like compared to October 4th? Here we can see October 4th on the left and the two versions of January 31st, the low and the high, on the right. So on the one hand, you could have an additional 13,000 units of capacity over October 4th, and you could actually double your affordable unit capacity through this policy, these sets of policies. But on the other hand, if the modeling that Cascadia and Echo Northwest have done bears out, then we would potentially see quite a bit less bonus capacity and affordable capacity, because there will be lots of instances where we've shown that 10% just is too much for the market to bear at this time in certain locations. The likely actual result is probably somewhere in between. Again, this is a range. It's not one or the other. It's going to be somewhere between the high and the low. So this is the October 4th draft, total capacity by council district. You've all seen this before. I've presented this to you before, so it shouldn't be surprising. But let's move from that to January 31st. Did you catch the change? Because it's subtle. There's almost no change, actually. And that's kind of the point. The changes that were made are getting smaller. They're getting more targeted. For instance, changes to where missing middle zones are applied. Those were also offset by some of the remapping of centers that Lacey talked about. So the net result, even across council districts, is more or less the same as it was before, but we're addressing that council direction with a scalpel, quite frankly, more than with a hammer like we used to do. But the real story here is, like I said, there's some uncertainty around whether we can actually get all of that capacity within the equity bonus program area and within -Vs, and that's represented by this orange portion of some of these bars. And so you can see districts 1, 2, 3, and 4, and to some extent 5, they all cross into that equity, the equity bonus program area to some extent. And so in those areas, we do think that if our modeling holds, that some portion of that orange may actually not be deliverable. So that's the trade-off that we face here. So to some of the other direction that led into the mapping that we can measure through capacity, the remapping of some what we call missing middle zones. These are zones that typically are associated with missing middle, R3, R4, RM1. We removed these primarily in areas that were deemed susceptible or in early type 1 phase of gentrification risk in the UT Uprooted study. And you can see that in the capacity. We went from about 16,000 units within those zones in the October 4th draft to just about 11,000 in the January 31st draft. So that's in response to your direction. But again, the impact to overall capacity was relatively low. This is what that looks like, again, across all council districts. So this is only the capacity generated within R3, R4, and RM1 in October 4th, which you see in the blue, compared to January 31st, which you see in the yellow. And you can see in several council districts, it went down by as much as a few thousand, but in most cases only between 50 and a couple hundred units. Across the board, there were reductions, so it wasn't focused on just one district, but certainly the reductions were quite large in some areas. But again, this is in response to direction, and it was offset by higher intensity mapping in some other parts of the city. So that is the end of my set of slides, and I think we'll go to questions, but as the last speaker, I do want to take this opportunity to just say that from where I stand, your understanding of the issues that this code presents is really, it's quite impressive. I do this work all over the country. No city goes to the lengths that you have to really understand the potential impacts of your code. You've test-driven this code more than anyone I've ever seen. So kudos to you. I think it's great, and I'm really excited to see that the changes that we're proposing, the policies we're proposing, are getting more and more specific. So I think we're coming to the end of the beginning of the next phase of this. So kudos.
Great, thank you. Questions? Greg?
Thank you all so much for all of the details on the capacity, and I appreciate how much we as council members look into the details, and I think it's just reflective also of our constituents that have gotten really well informed on the topic. From one thing that y'all didn't mention in your presentation that I'd heard from y'all when we've met on this is that actually the 397,000 that you presented on first reading draft probably had a range associated with it too. You picked the best number that you could, but that today you're presenting us with this 351 to 410 range, and when you gave us 397, there was probably a range there as well. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And so I think if we want to stick close to that 390 number, we have to sort of try to find ways to get close to the middle of that range between 350 and 410. And if y'all have recommendations or thoughts as a staff that might make you feel more comfortable, like we're edging towards the closer to the middle of that range, do let us know, because I think that it is helpful and important for folks getting these numbers in this presentation to see that, frankly, while there's been some movement of capacity, while we've said, you know what, in some gentrifying and vulnerable areas we're going to do a little bit less, in some centers we're going to do more, I think we're going to have some amendments so that in downtown and places like that we make up for even more of that. If you have ideas that keep us sort of closer to the middle of that range, do let us know, because I think that will keep us in that 380 range, knowing that we're not done. Once we pass the land development code, we're not done. We're going to keep on seeing cases come before us, hopefully lots and lots less, but I think folks are hoping that we stay, not go below 350, but kind of try to hit the middle of that range. So keep thinking for us about how we get there.
Okay, Dalia.
Just because of that last comment that you made about our deeper understanding, I was curious of other cities that you've worked in who have been working on this as long as we have, and not to say that, not to diminish our intelligence here, but I would say it might be because this has been an incredibly long conversation. What is it, 5 years since Code Next started? And so I'm just curious, compared to other cities you've worked in, has it been an as long conversation?
I think you hold that distinct honor. But it's not a bad thing. I mean, to have all this level of discourse about your code, a lot of cities will just sort of, they'll say, well, yeah, that looks about right.
Yeah.
And then they fix it later.
Yeah.
You're fixing it first, which is really good. But yeah, I started working on this project in 2012.
That's right. And so I think that's the important point, is we've been working on this since 2012. And so that, and it's good that we continue to have this discussion, but it's been a long discussion. So thanks.
Okay. And
just real quick. So I had asked for a tally of the lots within city limits that were proposed for zonings, the list of zonings that were not included in the capacity analysis. I assume that those same zoning categories were not included this time, right? Is that right? That's the RR, the R1, R2A, R2B, R2C, and R3, right?
Those were modeled as part of capacity, yes.
Oh, well, they weren't modeled the first time. So did you change the approach this time? So what I mean is, the first time my understanding was that there wasn't a factor applied to them because there wasn't a way to, as you all explained it, there wasn't a number that you could apply because that was up to decisions of individuals, and there wasn't a way to estimate how often they would take advantage of it.
So this was the question about our assumption that the capacity changes would only occur on vacant land. So they were modeled.
Right.
Okay,
That's right.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Yeah. So you didn't change that methodology.
That
did you?
methodology has not changed.
Okay. All right. Then I just wanted to remind the staff that I had asked for a tally of those lots, number of lots, and I haven't gotten that yet. So.
Do we know the total capacity of new missing middle housing and how much of that is in transition zones?
We, at this time, as we reported in the presentation, we can report the total number of units produced within those 3 zones that we most closely associate with missing middle. We're working on getting the updated transition areas boundary computed, and we should be able to deliver that tomorrow.
Okay, great, thank you. Leslie, tomorrow.
Thanks.
I didn't understand what you asked for.
I just wanted to break out of where we were missing middle housing as part of the overall capacity number, how much that's missing middle housing.
Okay.
And the answer was that can be found in like 3 different areas.
Okay.
We'll get those numbers tomorrow.
And that would be R4 and RM, right?
Yeah, so we reported the total
Okay.
capacity within those zones citywide, but not the portion that
Okay.
only exists in those transition areas.
Yep.
Okay, so are we still on target for the 135,000 units?
There is more capacity than
The 135,000.
than the strategic housing blueprint goal, but not 3 times the amount potentially if you take the lower end of the range.
But it might be more if you take the higher end of the range.
That's correct.
Okay. I would like to get another iteration of the charts that are on the pages number 50s going forward, where you've got total capacity by council district, you've got October 4 and January 31. I'd like to add a bar next to these that shows the target for each district, and then if you could put in the actual numbers in here, it's hard to really know what these numbers are with the bar graph. That would be great. And then also, I'm not finding it in your documents, so I would like this additional information, the total market feasible missing middle figures. I think this may be what Steve is talking about, and I'd like it just for my district, although I'm sure other people would like it for their districts, but I'd like the total market feasible missing middle figures. And from the first reading map compared to the second reading map.
I'm not sure I follow. Are you referring to you would like us to make an assumption that some missing middle redevelopment occurs on existing developed single-family lots?
I think that threaded throughout all of our conversations is exactly that kind of assumption. We are making assumptions about missing middle where it isn't, and why isn't it there, and can we put it there, and if so, how? Mm-hmm. And so as far as market feasible missing middle, which is the most likely to be built, I would guess I'd like to see a comparison of those numbers from the first reading map that we had in December and this map. And then the difference between those two figures, if it differs in a zoning district or a housing type, so that we can get a better handle on exactly what it is we're doing, the impact of our changes. The capacity stuff is really at the heart, I think, of what we're trying to do with regard to ensuring that there are lower cost housing units for everybody in our city who can't afford the more expensive ones. I don't think we're going to know. We still don't know. We're still guessing because we don't have actual data to prove up how many we think will be built and where. So I'd like to drill down a little bit more and ask again for the overall units mapped in the city, market feasible or not. We did ask to have those figures provided at the first reading, and this is getting a little bit closer, but it's still not exactly what we're looking for.
I've explained previously that we can't, because of the reasons that Councilmember Kitchen brought up, it's not possible for us to make assumptions about what individual property owners would do with their property. It would be a misrepresentation of our ability to do that.
Completely, but we are making some assumptions here, and so using the assumptions that you have used throughout this process. I'd like to get a little bit closer to where we think these numbers are going to fall out.
I'll have to discuss with staff if that's going to be possible to do. It would require a complete realignment of our assumptions that we've used throughout this process. So I'm not sure we'll be able to do that.
And I think
we'll
maybe
try.
having that conversation about what the assumptions are that you've used, maybe we could have like a one-on-one and sit down and really parcel through that.
Sure.
I think that would be helpful. But again, we're kind of scattershot. Our approach is scattershot here still. And so I really would like us to be more targeted with more specific information. Thank you.
Yeah, Jimmy Flanagan. Jimmy.
Just kind of on that point, I'm concerned, and I've said this before, about asking staff to do more and more granular analysis. The more granular we get, the less accurate, because the more the assumptions become bigger parts of the math. And I would really hate for us to be putting out information to the public that has, a 50% margin of error or some type of really unusable for analysis or decision making. So I entertain any idea from a council member, but please, know that I'm not interested in having y'all do a ton of work that's going to end up not being valuable for decision making purposes.
And that is my chief concern, is that we can't stand behind those sorts of numbers. It's just not possible for us to get to that level of detail. And I'd also just underscore briefly that the purpose of this tool is not to be a crystal ball. It's a relative measurement of where our policies are getting us. Are we moving the needle in a better direction or not? So we're not going to get all the answers from this, unfortunately. But as I said before, you're already doing light years more than any city has ever done.
And I would just add, again, council districts were not drawn to be planning areas. So comparing the numbers by district becomes very challenging because there's very different levels of acreage and very different levels of current condition, and in some cases already some pretty significant entitlements like downtown and Robinson Ranch and Lakeline in my area. So it becomes a very challenging comparison because that's just not why they were drawn the way they were drawn.
Mayor, I'd just like to add to
Real fast.
what Jimmy was saying, that that may be. And we know that there are arbitrary lines, and nobody knew we would be doing these exercises when those lines were drawn. But we did assign certain numbers to each of those districts. And we do have targets for each of our districts. And to the extent that we're able to meet them or miss them depends on how we distribute the housing units throughout the city. And so I think what you're saying is accurate, but we also have put together this task in front of us that we've given ourselves numbers to achieve.
Okay. Kathy, did you turn off your light?
Just because I had knocked everything onto the floor and was creating a lot of noise.
Kathy.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, this is a complicated conversation because on the one hand, I understand what you're saying about it being assisting, those numbers assisting us in measuring the relative impact of different policies. On the other hand, we have also heard, including today, conversations about, we need to bump up to that higher level of numbers. So on the one hand, we're talking about the fact that, I think there are some who want to see us really hit a particular number and are kind of, and that number seems to be driving a lot of the conversation. On the other hand, we know that there's going to be redevelopment of properties. We know people are going to build ADUs, and that if we're really going to be driven by trying to hit a particular number, those numbers should count too, because people will add ADUs. They will add that third unit. They will redevelop a property. So, I would say that the kind of intense focus on achieving a particular number has certainly woven its way in and out of our conversations, and so that's why I would support and believe we need that estimate of what the total number of units that have been mapped is. I forgot what you called it, and I know Councilmember Kitchen had talked about it the first time through. So that's just my thoughts on that one. Thank you for providing this chart. I need to understand. I'm still not clear, Mayor Adler, on what you were asking a question that I thought was answered on this.
I don't know that all of those units appear in the transition zone, and there's not a number associated with those, so I can scale those off as best I can. looks to be about 12,000 units by district. Before it looked like to be about 16,000 units. But I don't know how many of that. I don't know if we have any units outside of the transition zone. So I asked that question kind of just to get the number as well.
And I guess what's sort of confusing is that we've defined the transition zone as being the places where these zonings happen. And so with the exception maybe of R3. And so that's just a point of confusion. So I guess what you're saying is this is a subset of that larger question.
I was asking that question, but for me, the transition zone is the area between what's happening at the corridors and what's happening internally. So we have some areas where there may very well be missing middle housing that, in my mind, are not in transition zones. I don't think there's very much there. But I was just asking the question.
In some of our districts, there is a lot.
I'm sorry?
In some of our districts, there is a lot that's not in a transition zone. That is missing middle.
So that's why I was asking
I know.
the question.
I guess the common parlance, though, has become to talk about those as a transition area, just in the public. So I thank you for clarifying that question. I just wanted to be sure I understood. The redevelopment versus new construction by district. I think we may have had a slide after the first draft that showed us how much of the increased capacity was expected to come through redevelopment versus new construction by council district, and if possible, I think that would be very helpful to have this time as well.
So just to clarify, development, it's all new construction, but development on existing developed properties versus development on vacant properties, is that the distinction you're drawing?
Yes, because I assume the latter is you're redeveloping you're demolishing and redoing a structure, right?
I just want to clarify. That makes
I mean, is there another, you either have vacant land or you have land with something on it.
Mm-hmm.
When we're talking about, can you help me understand what?
My question is stemmed from your use of the term new construction as
Oh,
the
I'm
one
sorry,
versus
gotcha.
the other,
Vacant
but it's
land,
all
yeah.
new
Thank you.
construction. Just wanted
Yes,
to clarify.
yes. I understand your point now.
Okay.
So yes, if we could get the breakdown by council district of how much of the capacity is being achieved on vacant land versus how much is actually being triggered by the redevelopment, which is likely demolition and redevelopment. I think that would be helpful to see. And then just as a last observation, kind of back to the point I was making before, and Mayor Adler, I appreciate your willingness to entertain some conversations about how we might adjust the transition zone. You know, as I look at this, and I'm obviously more familiar with and more focused at the moment on my district than others. The capacity in District 9 is one of the highest citywide. It's about 65,000, 1,000 of which is coming in the transition zone. So we are, in my mind, rezoning vast swaths of some of our oldest neighborhoods that have been recognized for their compact, walkable nature. It has caused an enormous amount of upset among many of the residents in those neighborhoods, the majority of whom are renters in many of those neighborhoods. And we're achieving a very small piece of the overall intended capacity. So it's a lot of disruption, and I think is going to result in really significant redevelopment and very significant changes, potentially to the point where some of those areas are unrecognizable, potentially for very little gain. I mean, 1,000 out of 66,000 is just a balance I think we should have a conversation about.
Ann and then Allison.
You can go first since I used my time.
Everybody, you both have?
Okay.
You're both on borrowed time here, but there aren't any other lights up.
All right, I'll be very quick then. Let's see. So I had mentioned a minute ago about asking for a tally. Is that something I can get soon, or can you let me know when?
Sorry, a tally of?
This is something I asked for a while back. This is the tally of all lots within city limits that are proposed for zoning: RR, R1, R2A, R2B, R2C, and R3.
Yeah, we will get that to you. We apologize for not getting that to you prior to the release. We should have, so we should get that to you this week.
Okay, that's okay. I just wanted to get an idea.
To everybody.
Yeah, and then the last question is, so I'm just curious. So I understand that the difficulty in in the assumptions related to capacity has to do with the difficulty in assigning a number to the behavior of individuals, right? So that was okay. So, but did we have to? But I'm also curious about, and what was our methodology, or have we applied some methodology to make assumptions about the incentives that we were trying to think through for the preservation bonus related to different incentives around FAR and impervious cover to graduate those? And I don't know if you guys were, maybe you weren't involved in that and others were. I'm just wanting to know, what my question really is, have we had to make any kind of assumptions in other aspects of what we're trying to calibrate that relate to individuals' behavior around homes?
No.
Is that no?
No, it was more of a technical analysis of what could fit, what could not fit,
rather
that type
than
of thing.
in setting behavior and how people might behave.
Right.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So I want to.
Wait a second. Jimmy still has more time.
Sure.
His light's going on.
I'll should be quick. To Councilmember Tovo's point on the two graphs, the ones about total capacity and the missing middle zones, there's a big gap between. I mean, most of the capacity is not coming from the missing middle zones. So, high level, where is it coming from?
Well, I would say it's tough for me to answer that question. Right
Okay, let me ask it differently then. I think a lot of the conversation in the community is about transition zones, but we can see it's a pretty small part of the total.
I understand.
Right? I would assume a lot of the capacity in my district comes from commercial redevelopment, because there's a lot of commercial, underused, big flat parking lots. I got car dealerships and the like that'll be redeveloped. Am I kind of in the ballpark here?
Corridors, mostly.
Commercial properties on corridors that aren't the missing middle zones.
The land area that the model is showing that would likely change or has capacity to change is very, very small overall, citywide. Most of the city, we don't think anything would really change significantly.
Will you say that louder and more directly into the microphone, please?
Sorry. We don't think that there's capacity for change in most of the city. It's really confined to mostly corridors and centers.
I liked it the way you said it the last time.
Sorry. Maybe we can play at the audio on the way back.
Okay, so I mean, I think that's kind of I didn't notice that as a takeaway when I went through these, because the numbers on the y-axis are very different between the one chart to the next chart. So it's something that I think I'm going to kind of ruminate about a little bit. Thanks.
Allison.
So I just want to reiterate the concern very briefly that we're not counting what's being rezoned on single family. We're not counting the ADUs. We're now creating a whole process to graduate the impervious cover and graduate the FAR, which presumably has a goal of increasing the number of units we're getting on those lots. So there's capacity that's coming there. I understand you can't model it, but as we're trying to do our accounting, it's important to understand that there are units there. We have no idea the number of units that we've rezoned, so we can't even come up with a ballpark. Even if we said 10% of those lots would be rezoned and give us one more lot, we'd probably get a lot of units. So we do need to have those numbers, and we should keep that in mind. Going back to page 60 and that chart, I want to clarify. So that is the number for the capacity. That's not the number of lots that have been zoned missing middle. Is that correct?
That's exactly right.
So can we get a chart like this that has the number of lots by district that have been zoned missing middle? Because I'm very surprised, given the numbers that we've been hearing and the maps that we've been looking at in detail, that District 9 has less capacity coming out of the transition zone than District 8 or District 7 or District 10. It looks like District 5 and District 1. And so we really need to be having a better understanding of where we're just putting a color on a map and making people mad, but we're getting no capacity. And somehow there's some economic understanding that we do not have or we're not fleshing out here. But we're going and putting these colors because we've made up these rules, but maybe there's another rule that would allow us not to do it where it's not going to yield capacity in general, because then when you get that one odd lot, you're creating some randomness that doesn't follow any planning principles. So I'd really like to see that. And the other thing that I'd like to see is I'd like to understand what is missing middle that's not in the transition area off of the corridors, because we've now just added a bunch of missing middle that's not on a transition area, whether it's in an activity center or I have it just in the middle of neighborhoods that is not arguably a transition center, is just high opportunity. But I don't have any way of knowing what you're counting as capacity for that. And, you know, if we're going to get a lot of capacity, we should know that. But if we're not going to get a lot of capacity and we know that, then maybe we shouldn't rezone it and create a lot of angst in the community over a land development code change that we need to adopt. So we really do need that kind of data. And I understand you can't give it to us on a lot-by-lot basis, but you must have a lot more data than this, because otherwise how did you get to these numbers, and how do we possibly get a situation where the capacity in District 9 from missing middle is less than all those other districts? I'm not seeing that on the maps at all. Do you have any other insights beyond giving us the graphics that I asked for?
I'm not able to say offhand whether the number of lots zoned R3, R4, or RM1 increased or decreased, but we can certainly produce that number. And so perhaps the story will be clear for you at that time.
But it was still bad in draft 1. I mean, it's not a matter only of whether it went from draft 1 to draft 2. It's what is our zone, what have we zoned versus what are we getting a capacity of? Mm-hmm. Because you can look in some of these neighborhoods and nobody's ever going to build some of these things. The lots are too small. I mean, the number of lots you have to combine. I mean,
that's exactly why we can't produce the estimate that you're asking for, because it is so complex and there are so many.
You can tell me how many lots you've zoned this,
Certainly.
And you can tell me what your capacity number is, and you can tell me that by district. And you probably have some lower level, catchment that you have than the district.
Getting back to what Councilmember Flanagan said, we don't want to produce estimates that we can't stand behind. And if we did that, I would not be able to stand behind them, because we cannot estimate what someone who owns the property would do with their land. It's often not an economically rational choice that they're making. So unfortunately, I don't have the number. It's not like it's sitting somewhere and I can just give it to you. I'm sorry, but we just don't.
I mean, there's just a fundamental assumption underlying this with the transition zones, and we're getting 11,000 capacity. I could go take a couple warehouses in North Austin and give somebody, 6 stories worth of residential capacity on a transit line, and I'd get more units and I'd be guaranteed to get them. We just have to. I mean, there are choices and planning options that we could do, and there's several places in the city where we could do that if we planned it. And so, I mean, the transition zones are really what is giving everyone the heartburn, and we really have to understand how little we're getting from these transition zones. And they're going to not just create heartburn now, it's going to create challenges for folks moving forward as the neighborhoods change.
Certainly, and we will give you as much information as we have and feel comfortable producing and providing.
Thank you.
So I think there's a bigger conversation here that we should have, much of it for second reading, certainly before third reading. There's an advantage of having missing middle housing types, additional housing types than we have. There's an advantage to us having created density and walkability near transit ways. But I think the question that people have raised is a valid one for us to discuss. It goes hand in hand. I mean, we have a lot of consternation about and involvement with respect to transition zones. It also would appear as if the transition zones aren't going to bring about anywhere near the impact that some People are concerned about disruption in their neighborhoods. It's just not going to be that in their neighborhoods. So you can look at this from both sides of that same equation. I think it's an important conversation for us to have. Paige?
Because I still have a little bit of time left.
You do.
I wanted to use it up. I just know these next couple of weeks are going to be really difficult for all of us. I just want to remind people that a lot of people get scared about the buildings. They get worried about the bulldozers that they didn't call, they think are showing up for their house, because I know that this concern has been echoed out in the community. But this is about homes for people, no matter if it's solo home, if it's an apartment, if it's a duplex, or whatever type of housing option that you need. I hope that we enter these next 2 weeks with a bit of compassion, understanding that the 1984 Land Development Code we are currently operating under is the reason people are being priced out, and it's the reason we have McMansions. So I just really want to make sure that we approach this with a level of clarity, that this is about people, it's about renters, and it's about homes, no matter what size or shape they take. So please keep that in mind as we go through this next step.
Great, thanks. We have 5 minutes left. I want to say, in case people want to respond to it, there was a question about ending debt times on the sessions that we have. On tomorrow's work session, my feeling was that the group still wanted us to end at 5 o'clock tomorrow, work session, which is what I would do absent the will of the council being exercised differently. That gets us then to the work sessions next week. On the work sessions next week, we have second reading. My understanding was we have a full day that folks wanted to go till 5 o'clock next Tuesday. What I would do, absent direction, on Wednesday, it's kind of a broken up day. We don't start till 3, and we go to 3 to 5. Then there's a break. We come back at 7:30. I would suggest that we keep our calendars clear to go till 11 on that night. We're not starting until 3 in the afternoon. And then on the following day, on Thursday, I'd recommend that we keep our calendars clear again till 11 o'clock. My hope is that we can finish second reading next week. If not, I think staff's supposed to be reaching out to council offices about the following week. But hopefully we can get this done next week.
Mayor?
Question?
Yes, we're 3 minutes to 5. Does anybody want to say anything about the scheduling piece of this?
Yeah, I have a
Okay.
question.
Allison, let me go. Allison first.
My question wasn't on.
Sorry?
It wasn't on the scheduling.
Okay, scheduling questions. Yes.
So the Thursday, February 13, that you just said would go till 11 o'clock, we are starting at 9 in the morning.
We
on
go
that
from
day.
9 to noon. Then we're recessing from
On
noon
Thursday?
to 2:30.
On Thursday?
Yes.
Okay.
And then reconvening at 2:30.
Some of us have mobility committee, I believe, in that interim. I mean,
yeah, that's why we're taking the break.
I know, but for those of us on mobility committee, we're not going to have a break and then
So
to
my
go
my
till
point
8.
is that we're starting at 9 a.m. and going till 11 p.m. I just wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of that. I feel like a 10 p.m. would be more appropriate since we're starting so early and it's a busy day.
And we certainly, when we get there, we can pick. I was just suggesting that people, as they're making arrangements and the like, try to keep it open till 11. Hopefully, we can get this done. Ann.
Scheduling question. So we had talked earlier, and you said something about work session. So which of these days, does that mean that we're thinking that we start on Tuesday with the items that we identified that we needed more conversation about? Or what's your thought there?
My hope is we'll be able to work through some of these issues tomorrow. We're in work session from 9 till 11.
Okay.
Then we're going to break for 2 hours, and then we'll be back from 1 to 5 in work session.
Okay. So the conversation we teed up earlier today related to affordable housing we would have tomorrow.
Yes.
Okay. Second scheduling question. What are we anticipating, and what about public hearing? For last time we had scheduled a day for public hearing. So are we just thinking that when we start on Tuesday, people can come testify? Or?
Right, and I had laid out some parameters in the posting that I had put onto the board.
Okay.
Urging people to sign up as we begin our meeting. We'll take the total number of people. We'll divide by the 2 hours, but in no event will we go less than a minute for people being able to speak. but I posted something on the
Okay,
board last week.
I'm sorry, I didn't see that.
No problem. Okay. It's almost 5 o'clock. Anything else before we break?
Yeah, back to public
Kathy?
comment. I'm sorry, I think I missed that. I think I missed that proposal for public comment as well. Okay, I see it now. So is the assumption that this will be one continuous council meeting, and from Tuesday, when we'll have an opportunity to speak just once? Or are we ending and then reconvening a different meeting?
I think the council can make that choice as we finish on Tuesday, but my understanding is that you can't have a meeting that reconvenes over 3 days.
Okay, that was
so
the
in any
substance of my
event, that would
question.
happen
So
that way.
2 would be one day.
But the last time we
2
met,
days would be one meeting.
we had a meeting that continued on. We are noticed for 3 separate meetings if the council chooses to work that way.
So we're noticed for 3 separate meetings, and in no case can we have fewer than 2.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. With that said, 5 o'clock, this meeting is adjourned.
Multifamily. But we said we needed to see if that was a executive session or if it could be.
Yeah, I need to talk to well, because Trish told me she thought Law wanted to weigh in on it, and
For sure.
that's where I am.
Yeah.